The air in the closet smelled of dry erase markers and cheap paper, that specific, dusty scent of school supplies. But there was nothing mundane about the way the oxygen had just vanished from the room. We were only looking for a box of staples. That was the mission. But the space was barely wide enough for a shelving unit, let alone two women trying to pretend the sudden, suffocating proximity wasn't happening. I reached for the top shelf, my shirt riding up slightly. Alice didn't step back. She stayed right there, a warm, solid presence pressing into the space behind me. Then came the whisper, dropping under the hum of the ventilation, rougher than I'd ever heard her voice. I think we should start with the supplies closet first. My hand froze on the cardboard box. The staples didn't matter. The open house didn't matter. The only thing that existed was the heat radiating off her and the terrifying realization that she wasn't talking about organizing inventory. But to understand why that whisper shattered me, you have to understand the silence that built it. 3 months earlier, I was just the new hire, the chaotic variable introduced to a perfectly balanced equation. I was the art teacher, dragging a cart that squeaked like a dying bird, smelling permanently of turpentine. I wanted to cover the beige institutional despair of Northwood Middle with murals and papier-mâché. But the school had its own rhythm, a rigid, skeletal structure that rejected chaos. It was a place of bells and lines and absolute silence. And Alice was its architect. She wasn't just the history teacher in room 304. She was a fixture, as permanent and imposing as the brickwork. The first time I really saw her, it was after the final bell. The students had evaporated, leaving behind that hollow, echoing quiet that makes a school feel like an abandoned ship. I was wrestling a giant, drying canvas through my doorframe, losing the battle against gravity. I looked up, flushed and swearing under my breath, and there she was. She stood in her doorway, leaning against the frame with a stillness that made my frantic energy feel embarrassing. She wore a charcoal blazer that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle, her hair pulled back in a clip that didn't allow a single strand to escape. Her expression was precise. Not mean exactly, just terrifyingly composed. She radiated a kind of competence that made you check your own posture. She was watching me struggle with the canvas the way a cat watches a bug, detached, curious, unblinking. "Need help?" she asked. Her voice was low, a cello note in a room full of flutes. It wasn't friendly, it was just a fact. "I got it," I lied, breathless, my fingers slipping on the wood frame. She watched me struggle for another 10 seconds, the silence stretching comfortably for her and agonizingly for me. Then, without a sigh or a dramatic gesture, she stepped forward. She took the heavy end of the canvas, her movements economic and sure, and helped me guide it onto the drying rack. Her hands were cool, her grip firm. She didn't smile. "Oil paint takes weeks to cure in this humidity," she said, looking at the mess I'd made. "Don't let it drip on the floor wax. The janitor, Mr. Henderson, takes it personally." Then she turned and walked back into her room, closing the door just enough to signal that the interaction was over. That was Alice, efficient, unflinching, a woman who knew the name of the janitor and the cure time of oil paint, but who looked at me like I was a foreign species. I stood there, surrounded by my explosion of color. Paint splatters on the linoleum, clay dust in the air, posters hanging slightly crooked. Next door, her room was a temple of order. Through the crack in her door, I could see desks in perfect geometric rows, books aligned by height, the air smelling of strong coffee and historical rigor. I felt like a vandal every time I walked past her threshold. I was the splash of neon paint on her black and white photograph. I assumed she hated me. I assumed her silence was judgment. I didn't know yet that silence could be a language, or that the walls she built were keeping things in, not just keeping people out. I just knew that when the sun went down and the automatic lights clicked off, we were the only two ghosts haunting the halls. The cinder block wall separating room 303 from room 304 wasn't just a partition. It was a border between two warring nations. On my side, the atmosphere was a deliberate riot. I believed in the pedagogy of noise, the productive hum of 30 12-year-olds debating color theory, the scrape of stools against linoleum, and the eclectic playlists I curated to stimulate the right brain. My classroom smelled of wet clay and acrylics, a pungent, earthy scent that clung to my clothes like a second skin. It was messy, vibrant, and, admittedly, loud. On the other side of that wall, Alice presided over a kingdom of absolute, terrifying precision. Her history lectures were delivered with the cadence of a metronome. When her students spoke, they raised their hands. When they worked, the silence was so profound it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against the shared masonry. I often imagined her in there, standing before her pristine whiteboard, dissecting the fall of Rome with the same cool detachment she used to dissect my teaching methods. The friction was inevitable. It wasn't a matter of if we would clash, but when the pressure would finally crack the mortar. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, during my 6th period sculpture unit. The energy in my room was peaking. We were building wire armatures, and I had put on a playlist of upbeat indie rock to match the frenetic pace of the twisting metal. I was moving between tables, correcting posture and praising bold choices, feeling the rush of a class that was actually engaged. I didn't hear the knock. I didn't realize the music had been cut until the room went dead silent. I turned around. Alice was standing in my doorway. She hadn't entered the room. She respected boundaries too much for that. But her presence filled the space regardless. She held a stack of graded essays against her chest like a shield. The chaos of my classroom seemed to recoil from her, the students freezing mid-gesture as if she were a sudden drop in temperature. "Lillian," she said. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice cut through the lingering adrenaline with surgical precision. "I am currently trying to explain the complexities of the Treaty of Versailles. It is difficult to convey the gravity of post-war Europe when the bass from your stereo is vibrating my projector screen." I felt the flush rise up my neck, hot and prickly. "We're working on kinetic energy," I said, the defense sounding weak even to my own ears. "The music helps the flow." "The music is bleeding through the walls," she countered, her gaze shifting to the messy pile of wire and pliers on the nearest desk. She didn't look disgusted, which would have been easier to handle. She looked resigned. There is a difference between a creative environment and a chaotic one. One fosters expression, the other just makes noise. It was a sharp critique, undeniable and unflinching. I wanted to argue, to tell her that her rigid silence was stifling, that kids needed to breathe. But as I looked at her, standing there in her tailored blazer, smelling of dark roast coffee and old paper, I realized she wasn't trying to humiliate me. She was protecting her space. She was guarding the focus of her students with the same ferocity I use to guard their creativity. "I'll turn it down," I said, my voice quiet. She nodded once, a sharp, efficient movement. "Thank you." She turned and left, the door clicking shut with a definitive snap. The silence she left behind was louder than the music had ever been. I stood there, feeling stripped bare. She had judged me, yes, but she had also seen me. In a building where most teachers just survived the day, Alice was the only other person who cared enough to be rigid about it. That was the moment the resentment shifted into something more complicated. I started watching her door, and I realized that when the parking lot emptied at 4:30 p.m., her car was the only other one left in the rain. We were both staying late, hiding in our separate fortresses, united by nothing but the silence of the empty school and the drive to get it right. After the confrontation, I expected ice. I expected the cinder block wall between us to thicken into a fortress, reinforced by her disapproval. But strange things happen in a school after dark. The architecture shifts when the students leave. The frantic energy of the day drains away, leaving behind a hollow, echoing shell. The automatic lights hum with a low, insectile buzz. The vending machines in the cafeteria glow like radioactive monoliths in the gloom. It becomes a submarine navigating deep water, and we were the only crew left on board. We fell into a rhythm. It wasn't a friendship. It was a silent, terrifyingly domestic choreography. Every day at 5 p.m., the janitor's buffer would start its rhythmic thrum down the hall. Every day at 5:15, I would walk to the faculty lounge for a caffeine fix I didn't need, just to stretch my legs and escape the smell of turpentine. And every day, she was there. The first time it happened, I almost turned around. Alice was standing by the ancient industrial coffee pot, watching the dark liquid drip with the same intense, furrowed focus she applied to the Treaty of Versailles. She didn't look at me, but she shifted her body slightly to the left. A millimeter of space opened up. It was a concession. An invitation? Or just physics? I took it. We stood there, shoulder to shoulder, the machine gurgling between us. The air thickened, charged with the scent of burnt coffee and the heat of two bodies existing in a space meant for one. She smelled of rain and old paper, a dry, clean scent that made my own chaotic perfume of paint and clay feel overwhelming. "You're out of creamer," she said eventually. Her voice was low, skipping the pleasantries. "I drink it black now," I lied. I hated black coffee. "Efficient," she murmured. That was it. That was the whole conversation. But when I went back to my room, I left the door open. 10 minutes later, I heard the distinctive click of her doorstop engaging. The hallway became a conduit. The air between our rooms charged, carrying the tiny, intimate sounds of our existence. I could hear the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of her typing, fast, precise, relentless. She could surely hear the wet slap of clay or the scratch of charcoal from my side. We were working alone, together. The proximity turned simple acts intimately charged. Walking to the bathroom meant passing her door. I would see her silhouette framed in the harsh light of her desk lamp, head bent over a book, a study in solitude. Sometimes she would look up. Her gaze would hold mine, unflinching, for a second too long, before returning to the page. It wasn't flirtatious. It was an acknowledgement. You are here. I am here. We are the ones who stay. One night, my red grading pen died. I rummaged through my desk, nothing but charcoal and dry highlighters. I swore softly, a curse directed at the universe. A moment later, a hand appeared around my doorframe. Alice didn't come in. She just extended a red felt-tip pen into the empty space. "Catch," she said. She tossed it. I caught it. By the time I looked up to say thanks, she was gone. But the pen was high quality, expensive, the kind you don't lend to people you don't respect. It felt like a seduction, though neither of us would have called it that. It was a seduction of competence, of shared endurance. The empty school wrapped around us, sealing us in this vacuum where the rules of the day didn't apply. The tension wasn't just about work anymore. It was the heat of a wire carrying too much current. I was watching her, and I knew, with a sudden, chest-tightening certainty, that she was watching me back. The silence had served its purpose. It had brought us close enough to see the cracks in the armor. But silence can't hold forever. Eventually, the pressure builds until something has to break. And when it finally did, it wasn't about coffee or pens. It was about the one thing that mattered more to her than order. The truce we had built in the silence of the hallway was fragile. It was constructed of shared coffee and stolen glances, held together by the unspoken agreement that we were allies in the war against atrophy. But truces built on silence rarely survive the introduction of actual words. The fracture didn't come from a personal slight. It came, as things often do in this profession, from a student. His name was Marcus. He was a brilliant, chaotic whirlwind of a boy who could sculpt a perfect bust of Athena in my class, but couldn't turn in a history essay to save his life. I saw the artist. Alice saw the missing variable. When she failed him on the semester's most critical project, effectively grounding his grade into the dust, the protective instinct in my chest flared hot and blinding. I didn't wait for the 5 p.m. buffer. I marched into room 304 while the sun was still slanting through the blinds. Alice was sitting at her desk, a red pen poised over a stack of paper like a scalpel. She didn't look up when I entered, but her hand stilled. The air in the room felt cooler than the hallway, conditioned by her sheer force of will. "You failed him," I said. No preamble. The words hung heavy between us. Alice set the pen down. She took off her reading glasses, folding them with deliberate, maddening slowness. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were dark and unreadable. I graded the work that was submitted, Lillian, which was nothing. "He has anxiety," I argued, stepping closer to her desk. I could smell her scent now, rain and old paper, cutting through the sterile air. "He freezes up. He knows the material, Alice. I've heard him talk about it. Giving him a 0 isn't teaching him a lesson. It's confirming his fear that he's stupid. And giving him a pass because he has potential is confirming his belief that the world will bend for him if he's charming enough. Her voice was low, steady, and infuriatingly calm. She stood up then, and the dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Sitting, she was an obstacle. Standing, she was a force. She moved around the desk, closing the distance between us, until I had to tilt my head back slightly to hold her gaze. "You think I'm cruel," she stated. It wasn't a question. "I think you're rigid," I countered, my heart hammering against my ribs, part anger, part something else entirely. "I think you value the rules more than the human being trying to navigate them. You're teaching history, but you're ignoring the present." The atmosphere tightened. It wasn't the comfortable silence of our late nights. It was the crackle of ozone before a lightning strike. Alice took a step closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt like a challenge. Her composure didn't crack, but it hardened. "I value the rules because the world outside this building does not care about his potential," she said, her voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a sudden, raw intensity. "You get to be the haven, Lillian. You get to be the chaos and the color and the safe space. And that is beautiful. But if I am not the wall he hits now, while the stakes are just a grade, he will hit a wall out there that will break him." She wasn't looking at me with disdain anymore. She was looking at me with a desperate, weary intensity. I saw it then, the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. This wasn't sadism. It was a terrifying form of love. She wasn't holding the line because she didn't care. She was holding it because she had seen what happened when the line disappeared. "I don't want to fail him," she whispered, and the vulnerability in that admission took the wind out of my lungs. "But I need him to know that his brilliance doesn't exempt him from the work. I am not the villain, Lillian. I am the structure that keeps the roof from falling in." I stood there, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a sudden, aching clarity. I had mistaken her armor for emptiness. I had thought she was cold, but she was just burning at a frequency I hadn't learned to see yet. The silence returned, but the hostility was gone. We were standing too close, breathing the same charged air, the intellectual friction generating a heat that had nothing to do with the argument. "He needs the structure," I admitted quietly, the concession feeling like a surrender. "But he needs a door, Alice, not just a wall." "Then show me how to build one," she said. And in that moment, the rivalry died. We weren't opponents anymore. We were collaborators, standing in the ruins of our assumptions, ready to build something new. The rain started on a Tuesday, a relentless gray sheet that turned the world outside our windows into a watercolor blur. It was the kind of weather that made the school feel even more like a bunker, a sealed ecosystem protected from the elements. The tension from our argument about Marcus hadn't disappeared, but it had transmuted. The sharp edges were gone, replaced by a bruised, cautious awareness. We were circling each other, not as enemies, but as two people who had seen the wiring under the dashboard and weren't sure what to do with the information. I was in my classroom, grading sketches by the light of a single desk lamp, the darkness of the afternoon pressing against the glass. The door was open. It was always open now. When I heard her footsteps, I didn't look up immediately. I waited for the rhythm to stop. "Peace offering," she said. I turned. Alice was standing in the doorway, but she looked different. The blazer was gone, draped over her arm. Her white button-down was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of her throat. She held 2 takeout cups from the good cafe down the street, the one that closed at 4, which meant she had planned this. She walked in, not with her usual military stride, but with a slower, heavier gait. She set a cup down on my desk next to a pile of charcoal drawings. "Hazelnut," she said. "I noticed you grimace every time you drink the faculty lounge roast." "I didn't think you noticed anything outside of your lesson plans," I teased, but my voice was soft. I took the cup. It was warm, a grounding heat in the cool room. "I notice everything, Lillian. It's a professional hazard." She didn't leave. Instead, she did something that made the air in the room shift. She hopped up onto the desk next to mine. It was a breach of protocol so flagrant for her that I almost laughed. She kicked off her heels, letting them thud softly onto the carpet, and curled her stockinged feet around the metal legs of the chair. The stoic veteran was off the clock. We sat there for a long time, sipping coffee while the rain lashed against the glass. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable. It smelled of wet wool, hazelnut, and the ozone scent of the storm. Marcus turned in his outline, she said finally, staring at the rain. It was adequate. He used a highlighter. A highlighter? I smiled behind my cup. Revolutionary. For him? Yes. She turned the cup in her hands, her fingers long and pale against the cardboard. You were right, about the door. I'm good at building walls. I'm not so good at installing the hinges. Walls are safe, I said, watching the profile of her face. The shadows softened the severity of her jawline. They keep the roof up. They keep the noise out, she corrected. Her voice dropped, losing its authoritative projection. I bought my house 3 years ago. It's a beautiful place, Victorian, high ceilings, but it's big. And when I go home, Lillian, it is so incredibly quiet. I sit in the living room and I can hear the refrigerator hum from the kitchen. I can hear the house settling. It's a silence that doesn't feel like peace. It feels like waiting. She took a sip of coffee, her eyes closing for a brief second. I stay here late because the silence here has a purpose. The silence at home just reminds me that I'm the only one listening to it. I felt a pang in my chest, sharp and sudden. This was the crack. This was the thing behind the precision. You weren't always alone there? I asked, the question risky, probing a wound I wasn't sure had healed. No, she said. She didn't look at me. I wasn't, but chaos is exhausting, Lillian. I lived with chaos for 5 years. Someone who was all color and noise and impulse. It was exhilarating until it was destructive. When she left a mess. Not just a physical one. I spent 2 years putting everything back in alphabetical order. I told myself I would never let anyone disrupt the system again. She turned to look at me then, and the raw honesty in her eyes knocked the wind out of me. She was telling me why she was terrified of me. I was the chaos. I was the color. I was the threat to the order she had painstakingly rebuilt to survive the quiet. I'm not her, I whispered. I know, Alice said. Her voice was barely audible over the rain. That's the problem. I think you might be the one thing worth messing up the system for. She shifted on the desk, and her knee brushed against mine. A tiny, electric point of contact. Neither of us moved away. The heat of her leg seeped through the fabric of my jeans, a steady, anchoring warmth. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, terrifying possibility. The professional distance had evaporated, leaving us stranded in the intimacy of the storm. We were just 2 women sitting on school desks in the dark, the space between us vibrating with everything we hadn't said. Then the intercom buzzed, a harsh, static intrusion that made us both jump. The spell shattered. Alice slid off the desk, jamming her feet back into her heels, the mask sliding back into place almost instantly. But her hands were shaking. The open house setup, she said, her voice tight. Tomorrow night. We need to prep the hallway displays. Right, I managed, my heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The setup. She walked to the door, pausing at the threshold. She didn't look back, but she didn't close it either. See you tomorrow, Lillian. She left me alone with the rain and the cooling coffee, the ghost of her warmth still lingering on my knee. Wednesday night was the dress rehearsal. The school felt different, staged, artificial. We weren't just ghosts haunting the halls anymore. We were stagehands setting the scene for a play that would open to a critical audience of parents and administrators the next morning. The hallways, usually wide avenues of transit, were now cluttered obstacle courses of folding tables, trifold display boards, and precarious stacks of art projects. The air was thick with the smell of nervous energy and the industrial lemon cleaner the janitors had used to polish the floors to a mirror shine. We were the last ones left. The other teachers had taped up their construction paper, locked their doors, and fled by 5 p.m. But Alice and I were perfectionists, paralyzed by our own standards and trapped by the silent agreement that we wouldn't leave until the job was done. Alice had shed the blazer hours ago. It was draped over a student desk. She was wearing a crisp white button-down, but the sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, a sight that felt strangely illicit. Her forearms were pale and defined, the muscles shifting as she lifted stacks of textbooks to weigh down the corners of posters. It was distracting. I found myself watching the way her wrists flexed, the way a stray lock of silver-streaked hair fell into her eyes, which she blew away with a sharp puff of breath instead of touching her face with dusty hands. We were moving the heavy oak display cases from the library to the main corridor. It was heavy work, the kind that makes you sweat and breathe hard. "Lift on 3, she commanded, gripping one end of a cabinet, her brow furrowed in concentration. 1, 2, 3. We heaved the wood, shuffling sideways down the hall. It was a clumsy, intimate dance. "Left," I said, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. "Watch the locker handle." "I see it," she grunted, adjusting her grip. The physical exertion stripped away the last layers of our distance. You can't maintain a persona of icy detachment when you're hauling furniture. We were just two bodies moving in sync, communicating with grunts and nods and shifts of weight. The silence wasn't about history or art anymore. It was about breath and leverage. The air in the hallway grew warmer, or maybe it was just us. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting long, sharp shadows that moved with us. By 8 p.m., the hallway looked like a museum, curated and precise. We were exhausted. I was standing on a stepladder, trying to pin a heavy velvet backdrop to the cork strip above the lockers for the final display. My arms were aching, shaking with the effort of holding the fabric taut above my head. "You're crooked," Alice said from below. "I'm losing circulation," I shot back, gritting my teeth, sweat trickling down my temple. Less criticism, more assistance? I felt the ladder shift as she stepped up onto the bottom rung behind me. The air changed instantly. Suddenly, she was right there, her chest inches from my back, her height giving her the reach I lacked. She reached up, her arms bracketing mine, creating a cage of competence. "Let me," she murmured. Her voice vibrated against my spine, low and resonant. She took the weight of the fabric, her hands brushing against my wrists. Her skin was hot. The contact was a jolt that had nothing to do with static, and everything to do with the months of silence leading to this. For a moment, we froze. I was trapped between the wall and Alice, surrounded by her scent, that rain and paper smell, now spiked with the salt of hard work. I could hear her breathing, a steady rhythm that matched my own. If I leaned back an inch, just 1 inch, I would be resting against her. The thought was terrifying. The thought was inevitable. She pinned the fabric with a single, decisive push. Then she lowered her arms. But she didn't step down. Her hands hovered near my waist for a split second, as if she were about to steady me or turn me around. The hallway was dead silent. "There," she said, her voice rough. "It's straight." She stepped down. The loss of her heat was a physical blow. I stayed on the ladder for a moment, staring at the velvet, trying to remember how to inhale. I climbed down on shaky legs. Alice was already busy inspecting a box on the floor, her back to me. She was putting the armor back on, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "We're out of staples," she said, too quickly. "And the mounting tape. We can't finish without it." "I saw a box," I said, my voice thin. "In the main supply closet." "Right," she said, turning to face me. Her eyes were dark, dilated. "The closet. Let's go." The walk to the main supply closet felt less like an errand and more like a procession toward a cliff edge. The hallway was a tunnel of silence, our footsteps echoing in a syncopated rhythm that sounded too loud against the polished floors. I didn't look at Alice. I couldn't. The memory of her body pressing against mine on the ladder was still burning on my skin, a phantom weight that made my hands tremble slightly. We were walking toward a dead end, and we both knew it. The supply closet wasn't a room designed for 2 people. It was an architectural afterthought, a narrow sliver of space wedged between the boiler room and the faculty bathrooms, intended for mops, buckets, and the overflow of administrative debris. Alice reached the door first. It was a heavy, industrial steel slab painted a utilitarian gray. She pulled it open, holding it for me with that practiced, automatic courtesy that usually felt polite, but tonight felt predatory. I stepped past her, the threshold acting as a portal into a different world. The air inside was stagnant and warm, smelling intensely of dry erase markers, cardboard, and the sweet, dusty scent of construction paper that had been sitting since the 90s. It was the smell of elementary school nostalgia, but distorted, sharpened by the sudden, overwhelming awareness of the woman standing in the doorway. The space was impossibly cramped. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units lined 3 walls, packed with boxes of printer paper, jars of tempera paint, and precarious stacks of textbooks that were obsolete before I was born. The only light came from a single, buzzing, fluorescent strip overhead that cast everything in a flickering, sickly yellow hue. I walked to the back wall, needing to put distance between us, pretending to scan the shelves for the mounting tape we didn't really need. "It should be on the top shelf," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the dampened acoustics of the small room. "Next to the staples." I heard the door close. It didn't slam. It clicked shut with the heavy, pneumatic hiss of a vacuum seal engaging. The sound was final. It severed us from the hallway, from the open house, from the rules of Northwood Middle School. We were in a capsule now, suspended in time. "I don't see it," Alice said. Her voice came from right behind me, closer than she should have been. I reached up, my fingers brushing the dusty metal of the top shelf. I was stretching, my shirt riding up, exposing the strip of skin at my lower back to the stagnant air. I knew she was looking. I could feel her gaze like a physical touch, tracing the line of my spine. The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by a thick, electric tension that made it hard to expand my lungs. I was trapped between the cold metal of the shelving unit and the radiating warmth of Alice. "It's here," I lied, shifting a box of chalk. I can't reach the back." Alice moved. She didn't step back to give me room. She stepped in. She moved into the space that polite society reserves for lovers and secrets. Her body aligned with mine, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat emanating from her through her button-down shirt. She placed one hand on the shelf next to my hip, effectively boxing me in. Her arm was a barrier, a white sleeve rolled up to the elbow, the pale skin of her forearm dusted with the gray smudge of newsprint. "Let me look," she murmured. She didn't look at the shelf. She looked at me. I turned my head, and suddenly she was there, her face inches from mine. The fluorescent light reflected in her dark eyes, which were blown wide, stripped of all their usual stoic defenses. There was no history teacher here. There was no veteran. There was just a woman who had spent years building walls, standing in the rubble of them, looking at me with a hunger that terrified and thrilled me. "We need to get the tape," I whispered, the words tumbling out in a breathless rush. "We have to finish the hallway display. If we don't finish the setup tonight..." Alice leaned in. She tilted her head, her nose brushing against my jawline, inhaling sharply. The contact sent a shockwave through my nervous system that nearly buckled my knees. Her hand on the shelf tightened, the metal creaking under her grip. "Screw the hallway," she breathed, her voice rough, a texture I'd never heard before. It was the sound of the silence breaking. "But the list," I stammered, clinging to the last shred of professional reality. "We have to go in order. We have to finish the corridor, then the lobby." Alice pulled back just enough to look me in the eye. Her expression was fierce, raw, and devastatingly open. She moved her hand from the shelf to my waist, her thumb pressing into the soft skin exposed by my lifted shirt. "Lillian," she said, and the way she said my name sounded like a claim. She leaned her forehead against mine, closing her eyes for a brief, agonizing second, before whispering the words that would dismantle everything we were supposed to be. "I think we should start with the supplies closet first." The air left the room. The world narrowed down to the sound of her breathing and the terrifying realization of what she was saying. She wasn't talking about inventory. She wasn't talking about cleaning. She was talking about us. She was talking about the heat that had been building behind the drywall for 3 months. The start wasn't a task. It was a permission. The stoic veteran, the architect of silence, had just handed me the sledgehammer. And she was waiting for me to swing. The whisper hung in the stagnant air, heavy and absolute. I leaned in. I was going to do it. I was going to cross the line that would get us both fired, right there between the construction paper and the surplus textbooks. But the universe, or rather the Northwood Middle School custodial schedule, intervened. The heavy, rhythmic clunk, squeak of a mop bucket echoed from the far end of the corridor. It was a sound distinct enough to penetrate the haze of adrenaline. Alice froze. The raw vulnerability in her eyes snapped shut like a shutter. She didn't pull away frantically. She withdrew with a terrifying, disciplined precision. Her hand left my waist, the loss of pressure leaving a phantom burn on my skin through my shirt. She straightened her collar, smoothed the stray lock of hair, and stepped back. The distance between us went from intimate to professional in the span of a heartbeat. "Mr. Henderson," she said. Her voice was steady, but I heard the tremor underneath, a hairline fracture in the stone. "He starts the north wing at 9. We exited the closet like divers surfacing too fast, disoriented, gasping, blinded by the harsh reality of the fluorescent hallway lights. The transition was violent. 1 second, we were in the shadowed, dusty intimacy of the supply room. The next, we were standing under the buzzing tubes, exposed. I clutched the roll of mounting tape like a lifeline. I hadn't even realized I'd grabbed it. We didn't speak. We couldn't. What do you say after the architect of order suggests burning the blueprints? We walked back to the display case in silence, but the silence had changed again. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of the last few weeks, nor the hostile silence of the beginning. It was a heavy, vibrating thing. It was the silence of a held breath. "That's the last of it," Alice said finally, placing the final brochure with a trembling hand. She stood back, surveying the finished hallway. It looked perfect. Orderly, professional. It looked like a lie. "It looks good," I managed to say. My voice sounded foreign, rasping in my throat. "Yes," she said. She wasn't looking at the display. She was looking at the reflection of us in the glass of the trophy case. "It does." The walk to the parking lot was a blur. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and black, reflecting the streetlights like oil. Our cars were parked next to each other, 2 solitary islands in the empty lot. "Lillian," she said as I unlocked my door. I turned, my hand on the handle, half hoping she would cross the wet pavement and finish what she started in the closet. She stood by her sedan, keys in hand, the silhouette of the stoic veteran back in place. But her posture was softer, less guarded. "Drive safe," she said. It was a command, but it sounded like a plea. "You too." I got into my car and sat there for a full minute before turning the key. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to process the shift in gravity. The drive home was a fugue state. The windshield wipers swiped back and forth, a metronome counting down the seconds until I saw her again. I replayed the whisper on a loop. Start with the supplies closet. She hadn't just flirted. She had acknowledged the inevitable. She had looked at the mess we were about to make and decided it was worth the cleanup. I was brushing my teeth, staring at my own flushed reflection in the bathroom mirror, when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was late. Too late for school business. I picked it up. A text from Alice. No subject line. Just 5 words that made my breath catch. I meant what I said. I stared at the screen until the backlight faded to black. The truce was over. The negotiation had begun. And God help us both, I was ready to sign whatever terms she laid out. Daylight is a cruel clarifier. It strips away the shadows where courage hides. Walking into Northwood Middle the next morning felt like stepping onto a stage without a script. The text message, "I meant what I said," sat in my pocket like a live coal, burning against my thigh. I saw Alice during second period, standing at her usual post by the lockers, monitoring the tide of students with her standard military precision. She looked immaculate. The charcoal blazer was back, buttoned tight. Her face was the mask of the veteran, unreadable and stern. But as I passed, she didn't look at the students. She looked at me. And for a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Her gaze wasn't administrative. It was an open wound. The space between us compressed, heavy with the secret of the supply closet, before she nodded once, a curt, professional acknowledgement, and turned away. I cornered her during fourth period prep. Her door was closed, but I didn't knock. I slipped inside, the latch clicking shut behind me, sealing out the noise of the hallway. She was at her desk, staring at a blank lesson plan. She didn't pretend to be working. She took off her glasses and set them down, the plastic tapping against the wood like a gavel. "You're reckless," she said softly. She didn't look up. "You sent the text," I countered, leaning against the doorframe, keeping my distance but refusing to leave. "You opened the door, Alice." She finally looked at me. The exhaustion in her eyes was profound. It wasn't physical tired. It was the fatigue of holding up a ceiling that wanted to collapse. I didn't open the door, Lillian. I cracked a window, and I'm terrified it's going to bring the whole house down. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gray expanse of the faculty parking lot. You asked me once why I'm so rigid, why I treat this room like a bunker. It's not just because I like order. It's because this school is the only place in my life that makes sense. When I walk in here, I know the rules. I know the outcomes. If I work hard, the students learn. If I grade the papers, the pile goes down. It is a closed system. It is safe. She turned back to me, her arms crossed tight against her chest, a physical barrier against the truth she was admitting. The last time I let someone in, she didn't just break my heart. She dismantled the architecture of my life. And when the fire burned out, she left me in a life that was unrecognizable. Ash and ruin. I promised myself I would never gamble my sanctuary again, especially not on someone who brings paint fumes and emotional chaos into my carefully curated silence. I am not her, I said, my voice steady, though my hands were shaking at my sides. I pushed off the doorframe and walked toward her, entering her orbit. And I am not her. I don't want to burn down your life, Alice. I want to paint the walls. There is a difference. I want to be the reason you don't have to face the echoing silence alone when you go home to that big, empty Victorian. I stopped a foot away from her. The space between us was electric, filled with the ghosts of her past and the terrifying potential of our future. The smell of her vanilla shampoo was stronger here, mixed with the sharp scent of dry erase marker. I know the stakes. I know we could lose our jobs. I know you could lose your sanctuary. But the sanctuary is already compromised, isn't it? Because you're not thinking about the Treaty of Versailles right now. You're thinking about the supply closet. Alice let out a breath that sounded like a surrender. The tension in her shoulders dropped. She reached out, her hand hovering in the air between us before she settled her fingers on my arm. Her touch was light, tentative, but it burned through my sleeve. The risk was tangible, a physical weight in the room. You're right, she whispered. The walls are already breached. So let them fall, I said. She looked at me, really looked at me, with a mixture of fear and a hunger that she could no longer suppress. We have to be careful. We have to be precise. No one can know. Not until we're sure. I can be precise, I promised. Good, she said. And for the first time in 3 months, she smiled. It wasn't a polite teacher smile. It was small, private, and entirely ours. Because I don't think I can go back to just grading papers. The hallways didn't change, but the gravity did. To the students, nothing was different. Alice was still the terrifying guardian of history, and I was still the chaotic art teacher covered in clay. But in the quiet moments between bells, the air hummed with a new frequency. A glance across the faculty lounge wasn't just an acknowledgement anymore. It was a conversation. We developed a new language, a subtle brush of elbows at the copier, a specific coffee order left on a desk without a note. The open house came and went, the displays perfect, the parents impressed. But the real architecture was happening behind closed doors. That Friday, the rain returned. The school emptied out, the janitor's buffer started its rhythm, and I found myself in room 304 again. Not to argue, not to hide, to belong. Alice was grading, but she stopped when I entered. She didn't put her walls up. She spun her chair around, the movement fluid and welcoming. Done for the week? She asked, the corner of her mouth ticking up. Just starting, I replied. I pulled a chair up next to hers. The only light came from her desk lamp, casting a warm amber circle in the sea of shadows. The fear of getting caught was there, certainly, but it was outweighed by the thrill of being known. Under the desk, hidden from the door's window, I reached out. Her hand met mine, her fingers interlacing with a firmness that grounded me. Her skin was warm, her grip sure. It was a secret held in the dark, a silent pact beneath the fluorescent hum. We sat there in the quiet, listening to the rain, neither of us needing to speak. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was a shelter we had built together, brick by brick. We never did find that box of staples, but we found something that held better. The supply closet is still just a cramped room full of dust and dry markers to everyone else, But every time we walk past it, the air changes. It's a reminder that even the most rigid structures have doors, if you know how to ask for the key. If you've ever found heat in a cold place, subscribe and tell me your story in the comments.